Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So last week we spoke about Daisy DeMalka, and if you haven't seen that, then I will link that somewhere up here for you. And remember, she was South Africa's first female serial killer. But today we're going to talk about someone who is known as the monster of the Andes. So no, this is not a South African true crime story, but I stumbled across this guy and I heard about what he did and I just had to share. So before we start everything, I do just want to give a disclaimer that the story does involve crimes against children. So I'm just going to let you know about that. But if you want to hear about who the monster of the Andes is, then let's get into it.
Intended for mature audiences only.
So Pedro Alonso López was born on the 8th of October 1948, and that was in Colombia, and he was one of 13 children. There was not much that was said about Pedro's father, but it was said that Pedro's mother was a prostitute, and when Pedro was quite young, he would witness a lot of acts that his mother would do with her clients that were obviously not appropriate for a child to see. And Pedro did say that this did have an effect on him as a child. But one day, Pedro's mother caught him touching his sister inappropriately, and she chucked him out of the house, and he was 8 years old at this time. He was walking the streets, he was alone, and I'm assuming he was scared. And when he saw this man who gave him a place to sleep and some food, I'm assuming that he went along happily to go at least get somewhere to sleep. But instead of this man taking Pedro to a place where he could find shelter, he unfortunately took him to an abandoned building where he sexually assaulted him. So now that Pedro was homeless and scared of strangers, he would drift kind of from town to town, and he would sleep in alleyways and also in empty market stalls wherever he could kind of get shelter. So basically he would kind of live from hand to mouth, where he could get any scraps of food or any kind of money that he could buy food with. Now, when Pedro went to Bogota, I'm not sure how to say these names, my apologies, but an American couple found him, and this couple provided him with a place to sleep as well as food, and eventually handed him over to a school for orphans. So Pedro stayed in the school for orphans for quite a while, and when he was 12 years old though, he did end up running away, and some sources say that this was because he stole money from the school and he wanted to escape. But other sources said that it was because a teacher at the school was actually sexually assaulting him, who was supposed to be protecting him and giving him shelter. And that's a reason why he ran away as well. So it could have been one of these reasons, or it could have been both, sadly. We're not sure, but he did end up running away from the orphan school. Then what happened with Pedro between being 12 years old and 6 years later to when he was 18 years old is unknown. But when he turned 18, he did end up being arrested for stealing a car. And sadly, when Pedro went to jail, and his second day in jail, he was sexually assaulted by 4 men. Pedro did not report any of these crimes, and instead of reporting them, he actually made a shank or a knife, and he ended up going through the prison looking for vengeance, and he ended up killing 3 of the 4 men that sexually assaulted him. And authorities described the way in which Pedro killed these 3 men as self-defense. So instead of getting any more life sentences onto his sentence, he actually only ended up getting 2 years longer sentence. And for some reason, when Pedro left prison, he went on a vengeance hunt for young girls, and I'm not sure why it was young girls specifically. In my head, maybe it's because his sister was kind of, in his mind, the reason that he was kicked out of the house. So he may have had some hate towards young girls because of his sister, but that's just my opinion. I'm not saying that that is the reason why he went for young girls. But by 1978, it was estimated that Pedro had sexually assaulted and murdered at least 100 girls. And this was mostly in Peru. And what Pedro would like to do was that he would abduct the children from the small villages that they lived in. But this kind of backfired when Pedro was in the middle of abducting a young 9-year-old girl, and the people in the village caught him. And when the villagers caught Pedro, he was captured, he was stripped down, and he was tortured by them. And they were actually getting ready to bury him alive, until a female missionary intervened, and she said, please don't kill him, basically, and rather hand him over to police. So the villagers grudgingly released Pedro, and he was later deported back to Colombia. And sadly, when he was deported, the Peruvian police actually didn't take this any further with the people within the small villages of Peru, because they did not want to waste their time with small village complaints. So now that Pedro is free, he was traveling between Colombia and Ecuador, and he was busy snatching up these young girls, and it seemed like no one was really taking note because they were all from small villages within Colombia and Ecuador. And because there were all these girls going missing, a lot of them, the authorities and the police from the two different countries eventually decided that it was not linked to a serial killer because they had no evidence. They thought that it was linked to either slavery or prostitution rings. So in April 1980, a flash flood went through Ambato in Ecuador, and this flash flood eventually uncovered 4 bodies of girls that had been reported as missing. A couple days after the flash flood, a young lady named Carvina Poveda, she sees Pedro leaving with her 12-year-old daughter out of a marketplace, and she's obviously kicking and screaming, and the mother's trying to run and get her, and she's screaming for help. So people from the marketplace run and get Pedro, and he is held by the people in the marketplace until the police get there. And the entire time that Pedro was in custody with the police, he kept quiet and he didn't say anything, and the police kind of thought of a different strategy. So what they did was that they took a well-known priest and they put him in the same prison attire that Pedro was in so that they were equal, and the priest went and sat in the same cell as Pedro, and they were in there for a couple of hours, and Pedro eventually started saying everything that he felt, and he kind of told the priest what he had done. And then eventually the priest was like, okay, I've had enough of hearing this stuff. He went out of the cell, and now Pedro realized that this was basically an informant. And he just kind of confessed to everything because he knew then and there that everything had already been said. And according to Pedro and his best estimate, in Ecuador, he had killed at least 110 girls. Then in Colombia, he killed somewhere close to 100 girls. And he said many more in Peru. And then Pedro said, quote, "I like the girls in Ecuador. They are more gentle and trusting, more innocent. They are not as suspicious of strangers as Colombian girls." End quote. Yeah. While Pedro was kind of confessing to these crimes, he did kind of try and tell police that he lost his innocence at 8, and that's kind of where he spiraled out of control. So in Pedro's mind, when he was 8 years old and he lost his innocence, what he said to police was that he now wanted to ruin the innocence of all these young girls, as many as he could, because he wanted them to feel what he felt. And he said that he would go through these small villages and look for targets that looked innocent. And according to Pedro, what he would do is he would first sexually assault them, and then he would strangle them while he stared into their eyes. And Pedro said that once he was done with strangling the child, then he would want to move on to the next one already, because he could not control his urge to murder them. And at first, police did not believe what Pedro was saying. They were like, listen, you're over-exaggerating, you're lying. Until Pedro kind of led them to 53 graves of young girls. And these girls were aged between 8 and 12 years old. Later on in the investigation, they said that they believed him after he had shown them 53 graves, because in their mind, if you are willing to show at least 53 graves, you're going to go to prison for murder anyway. So they believed that he would have done the amount of killings that he said he did. So Pedro Lopez was first charged with 53 counts of murder, but then it was changed later to 110 counts of murder based on his confessions. So Pedro Lopez, the monster of the Andes, was sentenced to life in prison, which is only about 16 years. And the next bit is a bit fuzzy because Pedro went to prison, but then he was released by the Ecuadorian authorities. And this was on the 31st of August, 1994. And then Pedro was rearrested about an hour later because he was deemed an illegal immigrant. And then he was handed over to the Colombian authorities. And then when he actually got to Colombia, they then charged him with a murder that was around 20 years old at the time. But while he was in custody with the Colombians, they deemed that he was insane. So he couldn't go to a normal prison. They put him in the psychiatric ward of another hospital called Bogota Hospital. But then in 1998, Pedro was deemed to not be insane anymore. So he was given bail for $50. And then in 2002, the Colombian authorities issued another warrant for his arrest because of a new crime that surfaced of another murdered girl. But Pedro has not been seen or heard of since he had been arrested, and no one knows whether Pedro is dead or alive. I think round about now, if my maths is correct, he will be around 70, 71 years old now. And he could be wandering the streets still committing crimes because he got away with so many crimes before. So what's to say that he's not still doing it and getting away with his crimes now? So that is the monster of the Andes. I thought it is a very disturbing case. I haven't heard of this at all, so let me know if you've heard of it down below in the comments section. But other than that, I hope that you enjoyed this story. If you enjoyed this, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. And I will see you again next week. Bye.